the kind of sexual abuse that I suffered as a child at the hands of Father George Boxler it started when I was an altar boy, and there was a room that we would put the clothes on for the altar boy. I forget whether they were called vestments or something like that. And the priest had his there, and the altar boys had theirs there as well. And it started off with him kissing me, with an open mouth and lurching way over me like this and making out with me. And it disgusted me. And I hated it. However, I was, he taught that he was the Jesus on earth, and do what he said and what all the so-called authority figures said. And I told my parents about it, and that was just the beginning. And I said, Father George kisses me, and I don't like it. And my father said, oh, that's just an old Dutch custom. Father George was from Holland. And I realized that he wasn't going to protect me, and that no one would. And the sexual abuse escalated to groping and fondling and more. And it went on for 4 years, from when I was 7 to about 10 years old. I was suffering ever since emotionally. And I contacted the church when I was about 25 years old. And I talked with someone at the Carmelites in Middletown, New York. And I told the person I spoke with that Father George Boxler sexually abused me while I was an altar boy from 7 to 10 years old. And what I was told was, oh, well, the reason Father George did that is because he didn't know how to express his feelings. And that made me so profoundly angry that there would be no compassion, no care about myself as a victim of that sexual predator, pedophile, Father George Boxler. A few years later, I called the Archdiocese of New York directly. And I told them that Father George Boxler sexually abused me while I was an altar boy. And I was talked with such profound arrogance and extreme dismissiveness. And the person told me, we can't talk to you. You just need to write us a letter. And I was blown away. He didn't want to know more about what happened. He didn't say, I'm sorry that happened to you. And I again realized that the Catholic Church people did not care. They wanted to protect the church and their reputation at all costs. And one of the things that I realized is, as I've seen things in the news about Catholic Church defending either priests or defending bills from getting passed that would hold them accountable, the effect that the sexual abuse had on my life is I suffered with anxiety for many years. There's a lot of distrust of people for many years, and profound emotional pain that I experienced that only someone who had gone through that, can possibly fathom the amount of emotional pain that one would suffer. And there's never been closure because there's been no acknowledgement from anyone in the Catholic Church. There's been no apologies. And to this day, when I've talked with officials in the Catholic Church, they just get defensive. They circle the wagons and they want to protect the reputation of the church. And they even call them things like incidents that occurred or a scandal. Well, a scandal is one example, when someone who's married maybe has an affair with someone else who's married and they're both famous, and then that's a scandal. What I experience is not part of a scandal. It's a crime. It's a sex crime against children. And the two most egregious crimes on the planet are murder or sexual abuse in a child. And when a person sexually abuses a child, that's the murder of innocence. And my innocence was murdered. Thousands of other children's innocence was murdered. And from those crimes, most priests were not held accountable. And the people who covered those crimes up, like other priests, bishops, cardinals, they were never held accountable. And in any other organization that there were sex crimes, every element, every part of the hierarchy would be investigated. And somehow the Catholic Church keeps getting a free pass. These are sex crimes, plain and simple. It wasn't an incident, it wasn't a scandal. And the bill that is being attempted to move through the New York State Legislature, called the Child Victims Act, if the look-back window, to a one-year period, that anyone who's been sexually abused, not just by a priest, but by a Boy Scout leader, a teacher, a family member, whoever it may be, can have their day in court. And that is so profoundly important to happen. It's not about the money for most of the victims, most of the survivors. It's about holding people accountable. Not only finding out what happened, we know what happened with each of us. We want to find out who covered it up, who covered the initial crime up, which is another crime. And Cardinal Dolan, right now to this day, he is attempting to continue the cover-up of sexual abuse crimes against children in the Catholic Church. And that is why it is so critical that the Child Victims Act pass with the one-year look-back window. And one other point with that is in California, there was a look-back window that was included in their child protection bill. And because of that look-back window, an additional 300 sexual predator pedophiles were uncovered, and their names were publicly released. So not only would that look-back window give myself and the thousands of other men and women when we were children some sense of closure, some accountability, but it will protect children who are being sexually abused right now and who could be sexually abused in the future. And Cardinal Timothy Dolan is supporting the continual sexual abuse of children because of his stance against that bill. If I had the opportunity to sue the Archdiocese of New York and the Carmelite Order, what that would mean to me is that a thorough investigation would be done as to not only I know what happened to me, but it happened to most likely hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other children. And there are many people who haven't come forward to this day. And there's a very good friend of mine, we were good childhood friends, and his sister came up to me one time during a party, and she asked me, "Were you sexually abused by Father George Boxelar?" I said, "Yes." How would you know? Well, my brother was as well, and to this day he won't talk about it. And there are so many people who haven't come forward yet. So every time there is a suit brought against the church, and media covers that, it brings the shadows of secrecy to the light of day and to the light of truth. And I would think Cardinal Dolan, being Jesus' representative on the earth, would want the truth to be seen. Because as it says in the Bible, the truth shall set you free. And I would think he would be the leader of wanting to get to the truth and expose all of the people who have been covering up the sex crimes against children for decades and decades. And so that's what I would most want, is accountability. I want to know who knew about Father George Boxelar, why the sexual abuse against children, as I was then, was allowed to continue for probably 20 or 30 years. I want to know who covered it up at every single level of the church, from the Carmelites to the Archdiocese of New York. And I also want to expose every single person who is defending, protecting both the pedophiles and the people who are responsible for covering up the sexual crimes against children. Sometimes Christian people will ask in any situation, when they want to know what the right thing to do is, they'll ask WWJD, what would Jesus do? And that's a great perspective. if one is not clear on what the right thing to do would be in a given situation. However, if someone were to ask, what would Jesus do in regards to the Child Victims Act? Would Jesus support the act to protect children, or would he be against the act to protect pedophiles? And obviously what Jesus would do is he would support the act. Now, Timothy Dolan is supposed to be a representative of Jesus on earth. And if he's not doing what Jesus would do, who is he serving really?